They called Jimmy Stewart America's sweetheart. What they didn't know was that America's sweetheart had blood on his hands, and for 40 years he paid for it with $23 at a time. The envelope that arrived at his Beverly Hills mansion that morning contained just 3 words: "We know everything." But Jimmy Stewart's secret wasn't what anyone would expect from Hollywood's most beloved actor. The words on the page were simple, terrifying, and final. No signature, no demands, just the cold certainty that his deepest shame was about to become front-page news. Jimmy's hands trembled as he sat in his study, surrounded by awards that suddenly felt meaningless. Because the real story of Jimmy Stewart wasn't written in golden statuettes. It was written in guilt, delivered in silence, and paid for in cash that could never wash the blood away. The manila envelope had arrived at his front gate that morning, hand-delivered by a messenger who disappeared before Jimmy's housekeeper could ask questions. Inside, along with that terrifying 3-word note, was a photograph, a grainy black-and-white image of a 1954 Buick parked on a residential street. The same Buick Jimmy had been driving the night everything changed, the same car that had carried him away from the worst mistake of his life. It started in 1954, on a night when Jimmy Stewart made the biggest mistake of his career. He was driving home from the premiere of the Glenn Miller story, exhausted after a long evening, when a small dog suddenly darted into the street. Jimmy slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. He felt the sickening thud, saw the little body tumble in his headlights, and something inside him just froze. Jimmy sat there for what felt like an eternity, hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind completely blank. The dog was whimpering, still alive, and Jimmy knew he should get out, should help, should do something, but he couldn't move, he couldn't think. The shock had paralyzed him completely. His body was there, but his mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere this wasn't happening. By the time Jimmy's senses returned, he was already 3 blocks away, driving on autopilot, his hands shaking so violently he could barely steer. He pulled over and sat in his car, hyperventilating, trying to understand what had just happened. He hadn't consciously decided to leave. He had simply left, like a sleepwalker, like someone in a trance. The panic had taken over, and he had driven away without thinking. But now he was awake. Now he understood what he had done, and the crushing weight of that realization nearly killed him right there in his car. Jimmy turned around and drove back, his heart pounding, praying he could still help, still make it right. But when he reached the spot where it happened, the street was empty. Someone had already taken the dog away. Jimmy sat there in the darkness, knowing he had crossed a line he could never uncross. What Jimmy didn't know was that the dog belonged to 8-year-old David Sullivan, who lived in a cramped apartment with his single mother, Margaret Sullivan. David had been walking his pet when it broke free from its leash and ran toward the street. The boy had chased after it, arriving just in time to see a dark Buick disappear around the corner, and his best friend Rusty bleeding on the asphalt. David cradled his dying dog in his arms, calling for his mother, screaming for help that wouldn't come in time. Margaret Sullivan found her son in the street, holding Rusty and sobbing. She scooped them both up and ran to the nearest veterinarian, but it was too late. The little dog died in David's arms 20 minutes later, and the boy's heart shattered into pieces that would take years to heal. But here's where everything changed. 2 days later, Jimmy's conscience couldn't take it anymore. He had to know what happened to that family, had to understand the cost of his cowardice. So he drove back to the neighborhood, parked across the street from the modest apartment building, and listened. What he heard through an open apartment window broke him completely. The neighborhood was different in daylight. Working-class families hung laundry on fire escapes. Children played stickball in the streets. It was a world away from Beverly Hills, a place where $23 wasn't champagne money, it was survival money. Jimmy sat in his expensive car, feeling like an intruder in a world he had damaged and abandoned. Margaret Sullivan was sobbing, trying to explain to her son why Rusty wouldn't be coming home. But David wasn't crying about the dog. He was crying because his mother couldn't afford to bury Rusty properly, and the boy felt like he had failed his pet, even in death. "I'm sorry, Rusty," the child whispered. "I'm sorry we don't have money to do right by you. We'll find a way, baby," Margaret whispered, holding her son close. But Jimmy could hear the desperation in her voice. This was a family living on the edge, and his moment of cowardice had pushed them over. The cost of pet cremation, $23, was money they needed for rent, for food, for survival. Margaret worked double shifts at a dress factory, but it was barely enough to keep them afloat. David's father had left when the boy was 3, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Jimmy learned these details by listening, day after day, as he sat in his car wrestling with guilt. He heard Margaret on the phone with her sister, explaining why she couldn't afford Christmas presents this year. He heard her arguing with the landlord about late rent. He heard David practicing scales on a broken recorder from school, the only instrument he owned, dreaming of joining the band but knowing they couldn't afford a real instrument. That's when Jimmy Stewart understood the real weight of what he'd done. He hadn't just killed a dog. He had stolen a child's innocence and added financial burden to a family that was already drowning. The $23 Jimmy had in his wallet that night, the same amount he'd spent on champagne at the premiere, suddenly felt like blood money. That night Jimmy couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't look at himself in the mirror. He paced his mansion like a caged animal, surrounded by luxury while a little boy grieved in poverty because of his hit-and-run cowardice. By morning Jimmy knew what he had to do, even if it could never truly balance the scales. The next morning Jimmy mailed his first envelope. $23. No note, no explanation. Just an address written in careful block letters, and a desperate hope that money could somehow balance the scales of what he'd destroyed. But what happened next would trap him in a secret that lasted 4 decades. Margaret found the envelope the next day and wept with relief. Someone, somehow, had answered her prayers. She used the money to give Rusty a proper burial, but she also bought her son something unexpected, a used trumpet from the pawn shop. Rusty would want you to have something beautiful, she told David. That night, for the first time since the accident, the little boy smiled, and Jimmy Stewart, watching from his car across the street, realized he had accidentally created something miraculous from his moment of cowardice. The trumpet changed everything. David threw himself into music with the passion of a child who needed something bigger than his grief. Every evening, Jimmy would park across the street and listen to those halting, hopeful melodies drifting from the apartment window. Each note was a reminder of the dog he'd killed, but also evidence that something beautiful was growing from the ashes of his shame. Jimmy began to understand that this wasn't just about money. This was about witnessing the resilience of the human spirit. David practiced for hours every day, his music becoming stronger, more confident, more alive. The boy who had lost his best friend was finding his voice, and Jimmy felt both responsible for the pain and amazed by the healing. The envelopes kept coming. Every month $23, always unsigned. Margaret Sullivan began to see them as a sign from heaven, a reward for her faith during the darkest time of her life. She started a notebook, carefully recording how she spent each gift. Trumpet lessons, $15. Sheet music, $8. Thank you, angel, whoever you are. What Margaret never knew was that her angel was reading every thank you note she left in her mailbox. Jimmy collected them like penance tokens, reminders of the good that was somehow blooming from his terrible secret. David's musical talent was extraordinary, and by 1958, he was first chair in his school band. Margaret's notes became more detailed as the months passed. She would write about David's progress, his dreams of becoming a music teacher, his grades improving as his confidence grew. Our angel, she wrote one December. David played at the Christmas concert tonight. The whole audience cried. I wish you could have heard him. You've given us so much more than money. You've given us hope. Jimmy kept every note in a shoebox in his bedroom, reading them again and again. These weren't just thank you letters. They were progress reports on a life he had helped save after nearly destroying it. David was thriving, and Margaret was finding strength she never knew she had. But in 1960, everything nearly unraveled. A reporter named Carol Hendricks started investigating the mysterious envelopes. Someone had noticed the pattern, and the story of the unknown benefactor was gaining attention. Jimmy learned about it from a friend at the Los Angeles Times. There's a reporter asking questions about actors doing charity work. Be careful, Jimmy. The investigation was getting dangerously close. Carol had interviewed Margaret, David, and several neighbors. She had studied postal records and traced delivery routes. She was building a profile of someone wealthy enough to give consistently, but caring enough to remain anonymous. Worse, she was focusing specifically on Hollywood figures who lived in the area.
Jimmy learned more details about the investigation from his friend at the Times. Carol had connected the timing of the donations to several Hollywood premieres. She was looking for someone with a guilty conscience, someone who might be trying to balance karmic scales. She was getting close to the truth in ways that terrified Jimmy. She's smart, Jimmy, his friend warned. She knows this isn't just charity. She can sense there's a deeper story here. She thinks whoever is doing this has a personal connection to the family. That night, Jimmy sat in his car outside Margaret's apartment and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could stop the donations, protect his secret, and let the family wonder why their guardian angel had abandoned them, or he could find a way to continue his penance without exposure. The stakes were higher than anyone knew. This wasn't just about protecting his reputation. This was about protecting a family from learning that their savior was also their destroyer. Jimmy spent sleepless nights considering his options. He could confess everything, control the narrative, and face the consequences. But that would destroy Margaret Sullivan and David's beautiful story. They believed in guardian angels, in divine providence, in the goodness of strangers. How could he tell them their angel was the person who had killed Rusty? The solution came from an unexpected source. Jimmy's accountant suggested setting up an anonymous trust fund. For tax purposes, the man explained, not knowing he was helping to hide the greatest guilt in Hollywood. The lawyer was instructed to increase the monthly payments to $50 and continue them indefinitely. The family would never know that Jimmy Stewart, the man who had killed their dog, was the same person ensuring their dreams stayed alive. Margaret received the letter from the law firm with trembling hands. Her mysterious benefactor had just promised to care for her family for decades to come. She wept that day, understanding that someone had just committed to loving them forever. What she couldn't know was that across the street, Jimmy Stewart was weeping too, knowing he had found a way to continue his penance while keeping the family safe from the truth. David Sullivan graduated with a full scholarship to Indiana University's music program. He became a high school band director, inspiring hundreds of young musicians throughout his career. Margaret remarried a kind man who loved her strength and her mysterious story. They bought a house, started a savings account, and donated half of their monthly gift to other struggling families. Jimmy watched it all from a distance, aging with the secret that both tortured and redeemed him. Every month he would drive past the neighborhood, not to deliver envelopes anymore, but to witness the life that had grown from his moment of cowardice. David's children learned instruments. They went to college. They became teachers and doctors and musicians. But what nobody expected was how this secret would finally surface decades later. The years passed like pages in a book Jimmy could never finish reading. He watched David marry a music teacher named Sarah. He watched them buy their first house. He watched their children take their first steps, speak their first words, play their first notes on instruments. Jimmy became a secret witness to countless family milestones. He was there when David's son took his first trumpet lesson. He was there when David's daughter won her first piano competition. He was there when David opened his own music school and dedicated it to the anonymous angel who taught us that kindness creates more kindness. The irony wasn't lost on Jimmy. The man who had killed their dog had accidentally become the founding father of a musical dynasty. David's students went on to teach other students. The ripple effects of that first $23 envelope had grown into a tsunami of artistic inspiration that touched thousands of lives. Jimmy's $23 had become a multi-generational legacy, and he was both proud and tormented by what he had accidentally created. The Sullivan family had become living proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil. Every success, every joy, every moment of happiness they experienced was built on the foundation of Jimmy's cowardice and guilt. In 1979, Margaret passed away, never knowing that her guardian angel was one of America's most beloved actors. At her funeral, Jimmy sat in the back row, listening to David tell the story of the mysterious benefactor who had saved their family. "Someone believed in us when we had nothing," David said. "Someone cared enough to help without wanting anything in return." Jimmy wept during that service, not just for Margaret, but for the dog named Rusty, for the cowardice that had started everything, and for the strange alchemy that had turned his deepest shame into someone else's greatest blessing. He wanted to stand up, to confess, to finally tell the truth. But he couldn't destroy David's beautiful story with the ugly reality of how it all began. As the mourners filed past Margaret Sullivan's casket, Jimmy noticed something that nearly broke him completely. There in Margaret's hands was her notebook, the same small journal where she had recorded every $23 donation, every thank you note to her unknown angel. David had placed it there so his mother could take her gratitude with her to heaven. The trust fund continued for decades. David's children grew up hearing the story of the anonymous angel who had saved their grandmother. They learned about gratitude, about faith, about the power of unexpected kindness. They never knew their family's salvation had begun with their great-grandmother's grief. When Jimmy Stewart passed away in 1997, he took his secret to the grave. His will contained instructions for the trust fund to continue indefinitely, supporting not just David Sullivan's family but other struggling families in the same neighborhood. The lawyer was instructed to never reveal the donor's identity, but secrets have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right. But in 2017, 40 years after Margaret's death, the truth finally emerged. During a law firm renovation, the original trust documents were discovered. David Sullivan, now in his 70s, received a phone call that solved his family's 60-year mystery. David sat in his living room that day, holding the documents that revealed everything. He thought about his dog Rusty, about his mother's tears, about the trumpet that had saved his life. He thought about all the good that had somehow grown from what must have been Jimmy Stewart's worst moment. The revelation didn't destroy David's faith. Instead, it deepened it. He understood that redemption was messy, that angels and demons could live in the same heart, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the ugliest chapters. Jimmy Stewart hadn't been a perfect angel. He had been a broken man trying to fix what he had broken. That afternoon, David drove to the cemetery where his mother was buried. He knelt by her headstone and finally told her the truth. "Mom, our angel was Jimmy Stewart, but I think maybe he needed saving as much as we did. I think maybe we saved each other." Today, David continues the tradition, sending $23 envelopes to struggling families, not because an angel told him to, but because he learned that broken people can still create beautiful things. But here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever carried a secret that both tortured and defined you? Jimmy Stewart's story teaches us that sometimes our greatest failures become the foundation for our most meaningful acts of love. How many times have we walked past someone who needed help, someone crying behind closed doors, someone who needed just $23 to change their world? What burden from your past could you transform into someone else's blessing? Jimmy Stewart proved that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing love over guilt, action over regret, giving over taking. What act of quiet kindness could you do today that no one would ever know about? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness from a stranger? Have you ever been someone's anonymous angel? Share your stories, because sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we carry in our hearts. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible untold stories of quiet heroes who change the world one act of kindness at a time. Thank you for watching.